Summer Mathe Coletta, graduate of the integral class of 2006, who spent a year recovering from writing her senior thesis under my direction. Yeah, it only took her a year. That was hard, I suppose. She then went to Texas A&M, where she got an M.A. So that's fitting. In rhetoric, moved across the country to go to Pennsylvania State University, and that is the Nittany Lions rather than the UPenn
Quakers.
Quakers? Okay, thank you. There are two schools of communication at that institution, and Kristen was in the better of the two. I don't know which. And we negotiated long and earnestly over the topic of this lecture, and I still don't quite know what it is, but we're soon going to find out. And we hope that you are not drowsy after lunch and are going to pepper her with profound questions at the end of the lecture. And are you going to speak from your chair?
No,
or?
we will stand
okay.
and speak from here, and I will turn on the microphone.
And Kristen, there you are.
I was feeling rather small behind the podium there, so I'm over here. Please do just say something. If for some reason the slide shows a different quote than I'm reading, you will know I am off, and I would like to know as well if that ends up being the case. It really is an honor to be back here today. St. Mary's was where it all began for me, but I'm going to take you somewhere else and to a different time right now. Let's think back to February of 2011. Freezing temperatures. Thousands of public employees rally in front of the Capitol building in Madison, Wisconsin, chanting, "This is what democracy looks like." It's loud, it's physical, but there is some order in the chaos as groups of police, firefighters, teachers, tractor-riding farmers, and others unite their voices in objection to Governor Scott Walker's plan to change union rules and increase contributions by public employees to pensions and health care plans, something current students don't have to worry too much about yet. Just this past winter, federal employees were out of work as the president tried to advance his border security budget item through Congress. In both these cases, public sector employees spoke out both as workers and as citizens in response to those in power who argued over financial plans. Back in 2006, Brother Kenneth introduced me to rhetoric as a field of study, which when I asked the question, how are people persuaded? Little question that can be answered in, of course, a 2-hour seminar, right? I've continued devoting my time in exploring that question in the context of contentious policy decisions. Wisconsin and the shutdown raised more specific questions for me, such as, what do arguments over the value and role of public sector employees reveal about commitments to democratic citizenship? How do the ways leaders describe their roles impact citizenship? I'll explore these questions today by looking at the 2011 Wisconsin and 2018-2019 government shutdown. First, we'll look back at the developments in democratic thought that will be important for our understanding, as well as take a brief look at the history of unionization of public sector employees. Then we'll consider the rhetorical situation faced by Scott Walker in 2011 in his State of the State address to unpack what his speech can teach us about the potential consequences of a government leader's perception of the responsibilities of citizens. We'll look at the rhetorical response by unions and their allies too, Then we'll turn our attention to the more recent government shutdown to consider contrasting views of the value of public workers and national priorities. I'll round out this lecture with a return to our opening questions, then open it up for your discussion or grilling of me before we go out and have a nice grill out in Brother's backyard. All right. So in the integral program, we were introduced to the philosophical underpinnings of different governmental, economic, and social systems. We're all familiar with the concern that democracy can devolve into mob rule. Our readings from Athens and the Roman Republic also showed us the potential for citizen participation and civic engagement. Fast forward a couple of millennia, and we encounter the Founding Fathers grappling with how to scale up democratic principles for the former colonies. A republic with representative democracy, an economic system mindful of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and a society conscious of natural rights philosophy that had the potential for valuing every person once slavery was abolished and women and non-white people were acknowledged to be persons having the same rights. Let's pause here a moment to take stock. Founding the United States took a lot of talk as well as action. That talk took the form of public argument, pamphlets, speeches, debates, constitutional conventions, and the like. In this raucous time, people hashed out what it meant to be a citizen rather than a colonist or subject, as well as differentiated roles of leaders, elected officials, and the substance of citizenship flowing through all inhabitants considered to be part of the country. Women and slaves were apparently only 3/5 of a citizen, and Native Americans didn't really count at all. Power was granted to those seen as most American, property-owning white men. Their voting power was increased if they owned slaves or had women in the household or region, since representation was weighted for these factors. Fast forward to the late 1800s and start of the 1900s, and the US looks a lot different than in the late 1700s. There are no slaves. African Americans have the constitutional right to vote, even if Jim Crow laws are standing in the way of fulfilling that right. Industrialization and urbanization are in full swing, changing the social, economic, and physical landscape. Extreme poverty and extreme wealth are evidence of problems with the society and with the social and economic system. The progressive era sees organization of workers into unions, lobbying for better working conditions, living wages, and workforce and workplace safety. Though women in many Western states have the right to vote in state elections, the right's not nationwide, and the women's suffrage movement is making itself known. People are coming together in civic organizations trying to solve local social problems. Land-grant universities, like the state colleges, were developing robust rhetoric programs to teach students to speak well. Unions were also contributing, all helping prepare people for full citizenship. John Dewey was theorizing about the importance of discussion in social democracy, while Samuel Gompers worked for industrial democracy. These two concepts are really important for us today: social democracy and industrial democracy. Social democracy consists of conversation, informal decision-making at the small group level. It often functions on making decisions through consensus rather than majority vote, though we'll fall back on that method when an impasse is reached. It's seen in civic groups. This type of democratic action is available to all group members and distributes power. Grassroots organizations are able to amass individuals and leverage their power through numbers. Industrial democracy, on the other hand, refers to representation of worker voices at the table when management is making decisions that will impact working conditions, worker compensation, and responsibilities for workers. It extends principles of representative democracy to the workforce. Labor unions typically have democratic organizational structures where members vote for leadership and those leaders represent workers in their trades or their industries. Private sector unions were legitimated through the passage of the Wagner Act in 1935. It gave them special protections to allow them to collectively bargain, basically institutionalize the actions they were already taking. Both employer and employee unions were governed now by a third party, the government, and changes to the rules of their interactions could only be made legislatively, a process to which both groups supposedly had equal access. That same year, 1935, public workers made strides in organizing, particularly in Wisconsin, our state of interest today. And in 1936, they officially formed the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFSCME. That union worked for decades to change how public workers, civil servants were viewed. The image shifted from public employees as tax eaters, the key phrase today, dependent upon the party in power for employment and compensation, to vital workers in the economy and citizens enacting civic responsibility through their work. In 1959, Wisconsin passed the first state law granting workers the right to organize and collectively bargain. All right, we're moving up in time again to where we're interested today. By the 21st century, the strongest unions organized and represented public sector workers, not private sector workers. These unions include AFSCME and the American Federation of Teachers, American Federation of Government Employees, and the like. When I talk about public sector workers today, I'm talking about those who are paid from budgets funded by taxes. These include most firefighters, public school teachers, police, municipal, state, and federal employees. They provide public services and are not generally revenue driven. Public sector employees are taxpayers. They pay income tax just like everyone else. They pay sales tax when they buy things. If they own a home, they pay property tax. And most are also US citizens. They're particularly interesting to me because they enact citizenship through the vote, like all citizens, but are also doing civic work as their form of employment. It's a rich or deep sort of citizenship that's shaping the government and community through daily action as well as voting. When unionized, these workers are also engaged in industrial democracy. The deliberative nature of democracy, whether it's social, industrial, or political, means that rhetorical situations abound. An exigence to align and prioritize communal values persists. When decisions to be made about future actions arise, rhetoric is invited. In 2011, Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin was the first of several newly elected governors who was elected on a campaign to slash state budgets to actually move forward with his plans. His campaign promises constrained the types of arguments he could make once elected and the policy proposals that he could make. At this time, states were still recovering from the 2008 recession and looking at cost-saving techniques. The private sector already slashed pensions and moved most workers to 401k retirement plans. Government pension budgets were hit really hard by the Great Recession because they were invested in the markets as well, and they weren't yielding the expected returns, so they couldn't afford their commitments. Similarly, private sector businesses helped manage the pain of the recession by requiring workers to contribute more to their health insurance plans. Public workers, by comparison, earned lower wages on average, but they had a lot better benefits packages that required less out-of-pocket expenses. The unsustainable budget deficit presented an exigence capable of being modified through speech. Scott Walker wanted to change the public sector to look more like the private sector. These commitments are evident in his 2011 State of the State address delivered on February 1st of that year. Upon close reading, something I learned well in the integral program, Walker's arguments for his future budget repair bill and the description of himself are telling of his view of citizenship and leadership. This vision is a significant constraint to his rhetorical choices, I would argue, but also a rich ground for a particular line of reasoning. It may seem counterintuitive to start near the end of the speech, but there is one line that will help us better understand Scott Walker as governor. Okay. He says, and hopefully it shows this for you, I spent the past 2 years in a job interview with the people of Wisconsin telling you what I would do as your next CEO to get this state working again. Now, we've heard Hobbes' description of the state as Leviathan, concept of elected leaders as equal citizen representatives, but this gives us the metaphor of government as a business where the CEO's job is to maximize profits and the hiring team is responsible for finding a person with the requisite skills for that goal. Here we have the citizens as the interview panel or shareholders. Keep that in mind as we move forward. Walker emphasizes founding principle from the Wisconsin State Constitution as critical to his plans moving forward. He repeats frugality and moderation a couple of times and then modifies moderation to frugality and jobs. As I said when I was sworn in, it's through frugality and moderation in government that we will see freedom and prosperity for our people. That's really what this administration is all about, frugality and jobs. He sticks with the Constitution as mission statement here. In terms of maximizing profits, as businesses do, frugality makes sense insofar as money isn't wasted and profits increase. Jobs are how Walker sees increasing the economic prosperity of the state, which can be equated with profits in the business metaphor. He appeals to his stated values when increasing the urgency of advancing his agenda. Without swift, corrective action, entitlement programs and legacy costs will eat up more and more of the operating budget. Note the negative connotation of entitlement programs and legacy costs. Embedded in these labels for Medicaid and pensions for public workers is the idea that funds are going to people without their doing continuous hard work. Recall Wisconsin has a large Protestant population where a work ethic is highly valued. Not only that, the latter part of the statement implicitly frames public workers as a burden through the unwieldy costs they present. The shareholders in government, in seeking to maximize dividends, need to prevent company waste. Scott Walker treats the public employees like that notoriously underproducing department, customer service. Walker deepens his commitment to the business model of government by establishing a comparison between the private and public sector workers and their benefits. He says, government benefits have grown while so many others in the private sector have seen their benefits adjusted in order to protect jobs. Adjustment, aka cutting, benefits is cast as a job-saving technique, whereas not doing so and growing government is, by the same logic, implied to be bad for jobs. He continues contrasting the public and private sectors when he explains, currently, most state employees pay next to nothing from their salaries towards their pension, while the state's taxpayers pay more than $190 million each year on state employees' behalf. Walker never comes out directly calling public employees tax eaters, but if we fill in the piece of the argument, this enthymeme here from Aristotle, it's implied and functions to strip them of their shareholder status. This statement differentiates state employees from taxpayers and thus makes them look like they're getting a free ride, which isn't really fair. And the idea that they're getting a free ride was echoed in signs by supporters of Walker that said, "In the gravy train for public sector workers." So this was picked up, it was persuasive to people. Indeed, this argument serves to rhetorically move public worker benefits into that derided category of entitlement programs mentioned earlier. Walker next uses the principle of fairness to argue for his proposals to increase employee pension contributions to 5% and healthcare premium contributions to 12% for public employees. He claims most workers outside of government would love a deal like that, particularly if it meant saving jobs. Thus, any resentment or upset by public workers would be seen as ungrateful. Since jobs are key for profits and a sign of a healthy economy, civic responsibility is equated with making sound economic choices. With the government as a business, economic well-being is key. The balancing act that private sector businesses and workers experienced in the recession of attempting to preserve some jobs by cutting compensation so profits could be maintained becomes a model for government-employee relationships. This is manifest in Walker's use of an example of a Mercury Marine employee who was laid off, then rehired with concessions the workers made in the hopes of preventing Mercury Marine from moving its business out of state. Walker quotes him saying, "They've treated me and my family more than fairly over the years, and now they're in difficult times. I understand it's time to give back so that we can keep all of the jobs here in town." This man is an exemplary worker citizen, which is clear when Walker says, "While state government can't pick up and move, I hope that our state employees feel as if they've been treated fairly over the years. But, like all of us, they should recognize that we're in difficult economic and fiscal times. Essentially, these increased costs for workers are a concession workers can make to do their part and balance the scales of fairness, not only by eliminating a disparity between themselves and private workers, but also with the government itself." This last part is important to recognize because Walker, in acknowledging the state can't move, denies an essential power of business to the state. If the state government is thus less powerful, worker citizens have a responsibility to carry part of the burden in all fairness. The government is a benevolent management with its hands tied. The problem here is, of course, that the government isn't a business with profits. Its revenue is determined by taxes and fees. The dividends it provides come in the form of infrastructure, a social safety net for those capitalism leaves behind, and education that prepares the next generation to enter the workforce and citizen force. As we've seen, Walker took steps to differentiate public employees from everyone else. And statements like, "This is the right moment in time, our moment in time, to refocus government to better serve the taxpayers of this state." We're given a glimpse of Walker's vision of government responsibilities insofar as he suggests serving taxpayers, or the metaphorical voting shareholders, can only be done through contributing to a healthy economic environment and upholding principles of frugality. It, of course, means getting rid of the bloat in government that doesn't seem to provide direct benefit to shareholders. Public sector employees, despite paying taxes, are excluded from his understanding of taxpayer citizens here, since he positions them as tax eaters. At this point, we've glimpsed a rather detailed vision of government modeled off of for-profit business in the private sector, where the CEO makes decisions to help investors and maximize profits and minimize expenses. Responsibilities of citizenship center on being good contributors to a strong and healthy economic environment and acting frugally and repaying fairness with sacrifice during difficult times. It initially seems like a fitting response to the rhetorical situation. One piece, however, stands out both in the fact Walker only briefly mentions it, and that is the suggestion that he will right-size or shrink the government. In doing so, jobs will inevitably be cut, which is contrary to the exigence, and thus Walker was wise not to elaborate. But when Scott Walker introduced the budget repair bill, so-called SB 11, the cost-saving elements weren't the only provisions. On February 18th of 2011, Union leaders actually agreed to the increased health care and pension contributions. The rub with the bill that prompted so many people to hang out in the snow for so long, which I know is so unthinkable to us California residents, the rub with the bill came from provisions that severely limited labor unions' ability to collectively bargain and restricted the scope of collective bargaining. The bill changed the way unions could collect dues and set stricter requirements for union certification as the bargaining representative for workers. These elements of the budget repair bill sparked outrage by public workers, unions, their allies, and elected Democrats in Wisconsin's legislature. It's important to note here that police and firefighters' rights to collective bargaining were preserved in the law out of a fear of the consequences to public safety if they decided to strike. However, the police and firefighters were a visible part of the demonstrations in Wisconsin, so they did act in solidarity, even though it wasn't in perhaps their best interest to do so. Given what we heard from Scott Walker, it isn't surprising that he would try to weaken the position of workers and unions, since his vision of government has him as the leader at the top, not as an equal in deliberative discussions. It also brings greater meaning to the chant, "This is what democracy looks like," heard on the Capitol steps in Madison. Looking to Michael Moore's speech in solidarity with the protesting workers, we see how protesters sought to redefine citizenship and reclaim participation. When speakers use a series of examples and even tangents to build their case, it helps to look to the end, to their conclusions, to get at the heart of the matter. So let's do that with Michael Moore's speech. He says, "America ain't broke. The only thing that's broke is the moral compass of the rulers, and we aim to fix that compass and steer the ship ourselves from now on. Never forget, as long as that Constitution of ours still stands, it's one person, one vote, and it's the thing the rich hate most about America. Because even though they seem to hold all the money and all the cards, they begrudgingly know this one unshakable, basic fact: there are more of us than there are of them." He evokes the essence of democracy: people power and majority rule. This is put in contrast with what he calls the corporate states of America. Early on in the speech, he acknowledges the group's consciousness that we have indeed surrendered our precious democracy to the moneyed elite. Wall Street, the banks, and the Fortune 500s now run this republic. And they have bought and paid for hundreds of politicians across the country to do their bidding for them. Okay, something caught on my notes. In here, what we have is an example of an enthymeme that Aristotle gives us. It's at play, and the audience has an opportunity to fill in a missing piece, and the audience is expected to fill it in. And the audience is more than ready to fill in that Wisconsin's Republican-controlled government is included in that critique. Essentially, he describes government as a corrupt extension of the business world. As an ally to the public sector employees, Moore attempts to speak for them when he proclaims their message as, "We have had it. We reject anyone who tells us America is broke and broken. It's just the opposite. We are rich with talent and ideas and hard work, and yes, love and compassion towards those who have, through no fault of their own, ended up as the least among us. But they still crave what we all crave: our country back, our democracy back, our good name back, the United States of America, not the corporate states of America." And of course, there's chanting. In saying this, Moore levels workers and destigmatizes poverty and hardship by acknowledging you can't always hard work your way out of it, and the commitment to reclaiming the power guaranteed to citizens. and by extension, the public workers, to have a real say in decision making. Moore develops his vision of citizenship when he explains how the rich corporate elites, and though it goes unnamed, Scott Walker, have overplayed their hand when he tells us they had to have our soul. They had to strip of us of our dignity. They had to shut us up and shut us down so that we could not even sit at a table with them and bargain about simple things like classroom size or bulletproof vests for everyone on the police force, or letting a pilot just get a few extra hours sleep so he or she can do their job, their $19,000 a year job. The soul of democratic participation is a voice at the bargaining table. Voice and participation grant dignity. Raising their voices outside the official deliberation chamber is a way of recreating the agora. Although, at that moment, Democrats in the Senate had left the state to prevent quorum for a vote to pass the bill and so that the deliberation could ostensibly take place, the remaining lawmakers are not a rhetorical audience, though they can hear the protesters through the chamber's walls. Though technically mediators of change, they had already declared their intentions. The rhetorical audience was then other Wisconsinites whose beliefs and attitudes might be changed, and thus their votes for recalling politicians potentially or in the next election could be used and changed. The public workers and their allies speak out and reclaim their dignity through social democracy as industrial and representative democracy are eroded. Moore noted, "For 3 weeks, you have stood in the cold, slept on the floor, skipped out of town to Illinois," that's the senators, "whatever it took, you have done it. These actions function as persuasive arguments for collective action," which he names a revolt, "for reclaiming power." We're reminded here of Thomas Jefferson's prediction that once a generation, there would need to be a revolution of the Republic's value, for the Republic's values to be revitalized. These values are reflected here in equality, dignity, participation, and a selflessness that rejects greed. Power is dispersed to all parties, all people included and involved in these protests. The protesters do try to challenge Walker's economic arguments. Moore does this when he shares what he learned in high school economics. And here's what I learned. Money doesn't grow on trees. It grows when we make things. It grows when we have good jobs with good wages that we use to buy the things we need and thus create more jobs. It grows when we provide an outstanding educational system that then grows a new generation of inventors, entrepreneurs, artists, scientists, and thinkers who come up with the next great idea for the planet. And that new idea creates new jobs, and that creates revenue for the state. But if those who have the most money don't pay their fair share of taxes, the state can't function. The schools can't produce the best and the brightest who will go on to create those jobs. If the wealthy get to keep most of their money, we have seen what they will do with it. Recklessly gamble it on crazy Wall Street schemes and crash our economy. The crash they created cost us millions of jobs. That too caused a reduction in revenue. And the population ended up suffering because they reduced their taxes, reduced our jobs, and took wealth out of the system, removing it from circulation. Quite a lot you learned there. Well, this certainly adds value to educators and presents sufficient compensation for workers to live on and keep the economy functioning. It doesn't directly engage with the worldview expressed in Walker's speech we saw earlier. Instead, Moore blames low tax rates for the wealthy and implicitly business owners. He might have been more effective if he'd reminded taxpayers of what the government and its workers provide, such as infrastructure, protection from competition, a capable next generation of workers, protection of physical safety, etc. One of the significant constraints for the opposition here was the level of energy it takes to maintain and sustain participation in protests. Ultimately, once recalls happened in Wisconsin and SB 11 was passed, which became Act 10, it entered the judicial appeals process, enthusiasm and action weren't enough and weren't able to be sustained by rhetoric alone. Madison has been widely considered the birthplace for public sector unions, and it's always been a fairly good barometer for national sentiment towards unions. So let's leave Wisconsin for a moment and focus our attention on the federal government. We move forward to this past December and January of this year. Once again, a budget is pending in the legislature, and the executive is expressing his priorities. Although the contested budget issue this go-round isn't directly related to public workers, they again find themselves at the center of public argument. President Trump announced his intention to not sign any budget unless it included $5.7 billion for a border wall, which you all know. On December 21st, the previous budget expired, and without a new one passed, parts of the federal government shut down. President Trump proclaimed a crisis at the border in terms first of illegal activity, then as a crisis of security and safety, and finally, a humanitarian crisis over the course of the shutdown. His position was that funding a border wall or barrier would solve this problem. Yes, he also agreed that immigration reform is needed, but the wall was the point he did not fluctuate on over the course of the shutdown, and was the element that he required a set amount of funding for as the determining factor in whether or not he would sign any bill. Because positions on funding the wall were entrenched, it seemed like there wasn't much rhetorical action being taken to persuade Democrats to construct it. Instead, the exigency here was to reopen the government. The initial possible options presented for funding the wall or setting it aside so the issue could be discussed along with immigration reform once the government was opened again. The rhetorical situation was marked by hundreds of thousands of federal workers out of work, not being paid, falling short on bills and the ability to purchase food, and growing masses of immigrants at the Mexico-US border, as well as more asylum seekers coming into the country. Though immigrant detention had been a point of contention, the numbers were not perceived by many to be as urgent as a problem as they may seem today. The AFSCME president and president of the AFL-CIO both responded to the rhetorical situation in an effort to convince Trump and other Republican lawmakers to prioritize federal employees and pass the budget. They advocated for the provision for the border wall and immigration to be discussed separately. Richard Trumka, president of the AFL-CIO, spoke at a rally of federal workers on January 10th. He contextualized their experiences of the federal employees as part of the general experience of workers mistreated by tactics used by business owners, and constructed federal employees as part of the community in terms of patriotism. He said, "And let's call this shutdown what it is. It's a lockout. Hard-working American patriots are being locked out of their jobs, and for no other reason than the politics of fear. While strikes operate on the principle that by denying businesses their means of production, workers can assert their power by hurting the owners financially, the lockout is a way for owners to hurt workers by not paying them, which is a prod to get them to concede to existing or reduce compensation or the current working conditions, which presumably are bad when a lockout is used. Lockouts are most effective when workers are living marginally paycheck to paycheck because fear of losing shelter or food pressures them to acquiesce. By accusing politicians of using the politics of fear, Trumka suggests this is true for federal employees. Note that Trumka avoids partisan descriptions of the workers and focuses instead on them as hardworking American patriots. Patriots will fight for the country and uphold its unifying principles. He says, but because of these ridiculous divide and distract political games, these workers will not be paid for their service. Calling the tactics political games trivializes them and disassociates the political maneuvers from the serious work of governing and making decisions. We'll come back to the classification of political maneuvering as a political game, but for now, let's continue looking at what he's telling us. By identifying federal employees as workers instead of as citizens, he can extend sympathy to them from other private sector workers who wouldn't work without pay. By emphasizing that the work of federal employees is service, he invokes the patriot description earlier, and this serves as a bridge to his next description of many federal employees being veterans. These are men and women who took an oath to serve the public. They keep us safe. They care for the sick and the elderly. They help our veterans, and in the case of 250,000 federal employees, they are veterans. These workers don't do it for big bucks or notoriety. They serve because they care. They serve because they love America. Federal workers are valued for their loyalty to the public and, like soldiers, are separated from that public by their oaths of service. In some ways, this parallel ends up constraining public employees because it excludes them from participating in public arguments. He continues saying, this lockout is yet another manufactured crisis cooked up by politicians looking to score political points, and American workers are fed up. We're tired of being pawns in a game. This trivialization of the place of American workers by politicians is contrasted with the suffering of locked out workers he just described. By framing federal employees, and indeed all workers, as pawns in a political game, Trumka constrains potential action since workers are stripped of agency. He's able to heighten attitudes of anger. By using the terms another manufactured crisis, Trumka also suggests that the border crisis was manufactured by the politicians as part of that game. Friday, January 11th, was an important day because it was a day many workers received blank earnings statements, and the shutdown became the longest in U.S. history. Many workers fell behind on bills, and their suffering was widely publicized. You probably read newspaper articles, tweets about it, posts on Facebook. It was everywhere, including the nightly news. Ending their suffering became part of the rhetorical exigence. Pelosi sent a letter late Friday thanking House Democrats for passing bills to reopen departments and agencies. Of course, this never got signed, but she thanked them. And so she said, there's no excuse for President Trump to keep government shut down over his demands for an ineffective, wasteful wall. Trump is endangering the health and safety of the American people and stealing paychecks from 800,000 innocent workers. I didn't have a slide for this one, but you get to hear it anyway. By blaming the president and emphasizing the toll on Americans, Pelosi values federal workers above immigrants. She values the workers as Americans and as more weighty piece in decision-making, though doesn't grant them an active role in the democratic process. Here we do have some quotes to look at to help us move forward. The letter from AFSCME to the Senate on January 23rd takes a different rhetorical approach. It frames the conversation through the tagline, "We make America happen." The syllogism continues that the federal workers aren't working, therefore America isn't happening. Similarly, the letter seeks to persuade lawmakers that by doing their jobs and voting to pass H.R. 268, they could make America happen. Note the use of action words here. Passage of this bill will reopen the federal government, put public service workers back on the job, and restore the critical government services relied on by the American people. In this triad, he first indicates the immediate goal, then the economic goal of jobs, then points to benefits for other Americans, all things unifying across party lines. The letter uses causal reasoning to show the federal workers are essential for the health and safety, cautioning that the risks of contaminated food are making its way onto shelves is growing, as is the risk to those flying. While federal workers are shown to be valuable for providing safety and security to the whole of America, their value as citizens is not mentioned. Indeed, their engagement in the deliberative process lacks agency outside of communiques through their unions, like this letter. However, one persuasive element is present here. The indication that there is enough agreement and unity to make things happen to end the emergent domestic crisis, which is the suffering of the workers. The letter proposes a path through the impasse. Complex and divisive proposals on immigration and border security should be set aside for a more thoughtful negotiation than the current climate allows. Note the term negotiation suggests a give and take, not deliberation, where common ground may be found. Notably, Trump himself had little to say about experiences of federal workers. Instead, he was talking about the Dems, Pelosi, and Schumer. He mentioned workers on a few notable occasions, first noting the efforts to make sure Coast Guard workers were paid. Second, on January 18th, he acknowledged 800K federal workers out of work in a tweet. On January 19th, Trump delivered a speech that he seemed to think provided a way forward. He established early on that the problem to be solved was illegal immigration and open borders. Both sides in Washington must simply come together, listen to each other, put down their armor, build trust, reach across the aisle, and find solutions. It is time to reclaim our future from the extreme voices who fear, compromise, and demand open borders, which means drugs pouring in, human trafficking, and a lot of crime. By giving 3 years extension to DACA and TPS, as well as many other things in his words, Trump appeared to be negotiating to get the wall. Recall, however, that the initial issue was to pass a government budget. Those gimmies were unrelated and emphasized the point of contention had shifted. Trump was silent about the unpaid federal workers. He was silent about widely circulated stories of many being unable to pay bills, afford food and medicine. On January 20th, he tweeted, "Nancy Pelosi and some of the Democrats turned down my offer yesterday before I even got up to speak. They don't see crime and drugs, they only see 2020, which they are not going to win. Best economy. They should do the right thing for the country and allow people to go back to work." This tweet tries to shift the Democrat exigence from funding the government to winning the next election, but it isn't enough to distract from the stories of the workers. He continues to position the workers as a pawn in the political process. On January 21st, he said, "To all of the great people who are working so hard for your country and not getting paid, I say, thank you. You are great patriots. Loyalty and service, even without compensation, are the characteristics here." Trump's response to the rhetorical situation misses the mark. Trump generally ignores the experiences of federal workers. He instead emphasizes political partisanship with regard to the shutdown, and even tweets about most of the federal workers not getting paid being Democrats, though that, of course, was unsubstantiated. He never tweeted or talked about the suffering of federal workers as a reason to end the shutdown until he ended it on January 25th. This was in no way a concession. It was taking care of millions of people who were getting badly hurt by the shutdown, with the understanding that in 21 days, if no deal is done, it's off to the races. Even this doesn't focus so much on the workers, but people more generally. He also focused on the lawmakers, placing blame for the shutdown on Democrats and the threat of immigrants to safety and security. He treats this as a timeout in a game, adopting the perspective that union leaders cast earlier. Let's take a step back now from these close readings and think about what we can take away from these two cases. Let's revisit the questions I started out asking. What do arguments over the value and role of public sector employees reveal about potential consequences for democratic citizenship? How does the way leaders describe their roles impact citizenship? First, devaluing public employees in public argument reflects a weaker view of democratic citizenship. If public employees are a burden, even temporarily expendable, as in the case of the shutdown, non-essential, or useful only in their suffering, then their voting power isn't respected or valued. Let's extend that thought. It only takes isolating any group of citizens in this way, whether it's first-generation citizens, etc., to remind us that that citizen power comes from joining together. Reminding the public of the social and civic value of public employees can help unite citizens on shared values. It's also important to engage the worldview shaping the arguments of opposing groups if arguments are to be salient. We saw in Wisconsin groups speaking past each other because of failure to engage on the same field of values. However, protesters in 2018 and 2019 engaged with the most salient values of safety and security to reinvigorate federal workers with value, and a value more immediate than international safety and security. Mainstream news media carried stories of federal workers unable to afford gas, rent, food, and insulin. They carried stories of airport personnel working without pay, facing unstable child care and financial fears. These stories gave an immediate picture of national fear and insecurity. Statements by opposing groups provide constraints and opportunities in the rhetorical situation. Contesting values seems to work best when opposing groups attempt to speak using the same or at least a compatible metaphor. Leaders are in a position to advance their proposals and establish the commitments through the dominant metaphors they choose. As we saw in these cases, a politics as business model or metaphor and that perspective taken to an extreme that sees the game elements of the economy applied to politics positions the leaders as powerful, but also invites citizens to counter that assertion by arguing for their own civic value. So with this in mind, I welcome your thoughts and your questions as we think about how these uses of public argument, these rhetorical techniques help shift that balance of power within politics as we look to our world. Thank you.